Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story.
The house had been quiet for 9 years, and I had learned to live inside that particular quiet the way another man learns to live with a bad knee. I noticed it every night. I worked around it. I stopped waiting for it to go away. I am 69 years old. For 31 years, I ran a commercial law firm 2 blocks from the Buncombe County Courthouse, the kind of practice other attorneys called when they were afraid to sign something themselves. I retired 4 years ago and told myself I would spend my remaining seasons reading novels instead of indemnification clauses. Some nights I still dream in clause numbers. That Tuesday, I was asleep by 10. The phone woke me at 12:47 in the morning. I know the exact minute because I have looked at that number more times than I care to admit since. I picked up before the second ring. 40 years of late-night calls from clients in trouble teach a man that instinct whether he wants it or not. "Dad!" Meghan's voice came through broken into pieces, like a radio station losing its signal in the mountains. "Dad, please, you have to—" Something cut across her words, not static. A sound with weight to it. The sound of a hand closing over a phone or over a mouth. Then silence. Not the silence of a dropped call, a held one. "Meghan!" I was already sitting up, already reaching for the lamp. "Meghan, talk to me!" Nothing. I sat in that silence longer than I should have, counting the seconds the way I used to count the seconds of dead air across a negotiating table, back when silence was a tool I knew how to use. This silence was not a tool. It had a weight to it that pressed against my chest until I could feel my own pulse in my ears. I called back twice. Both times it rang through to nothing. No voicemail, no click, just ringing into a house I suddenly could not picture as safe anymore. I did not sit and wonder what to do. A man does not spend 3 decades untangling other people's disasters and then freeze the one time the disaster is his own. I was out of bed and into my trousers before the second call finished ringing out. I kept moving through the house on old habit, the same route I had walked every morning for 20 years, except this time it was dark and my hands were not steady. On the way out through the study, I passed the shelf where I still keep Renata's reading glasses. The wire-rimmed ones she wore to go through contracts line by line, hunting for the sentence someone had buried on purpose. I do not know why I picked them up that night. I have never been a man who believes an object carries luck, but I put them in my coat pocket and I was in the truck before I had fully decided to take them. The drive to the Houston estate normally runs 22 minutes. I made it in 14, and I do not remember most of the road. What I remember is the sound of Meghan's voice and how wrong it was. My daughter teaches second graders to read sheet music before they can read a menu. She has a voice built for calm, the kind of voice that talks a crying 7-year-old down from a skinned knee without ever raising in pitch. The woman on that call had not sounded frightened in the ordinary way. She had sounded like someone choosing her words in the half-second before somebody took the choosing away from her. I have spent a career learning to hear what a contract does not say out loud. That gap between the words on the page and the truth underneath them was the only thing I was ever good at. Driving through the dark toward my daughter's house, I understood I was about to need that particular skill more than I had ever needed it in a courtroom. I thought for one unwelcome mile of the day Meghan married into that family. 3 years ago, in a garden behind the estate, with caterers passing champagne on silver trays and Jocelyn Houston working the crowd like she was closing a merger. I remember standing near the hydrangeas that afternoon, with a strange cold feeling in my stomach that I never named out loud, not even to Renata's memory. I told myself it was the ordinary suspicion of a father losing his only child to a stranger's family. I have spent 31 years training myself to trust that particular instinct in a courtroom. That night, driving too fast down a dark 2-lane road, I finally admitted to myself that I had ignored it for 3 years running. The Houston estate sits at the end of a long private drive lined with hickory trees, the kind of property built to announce that the people inside it do not answer to anyone.
The iron gate stood open when I reached it, which told me something on its own. Gates like that are never left open by accident. I took the drive too fast for the gravel and brought the truck to a hard stop in front of the main house. For a moment, I just sat there with both hands on the wheel, the engine ticking as it cooled, and looked at what was in front of me. The house was dark. Every window, every floor, black glass reflecting nothing but the truck's headlights. Except for one. Second floor, far left corner. A single square of lamplight burning behind a curtain, steady and wrong, like someone had left it on for a reason and did not care who saw. I sat with the engine off and my hand already on the door handle, and I understood something before I ever crossed that lawn. Whatever waited behind that one lit window had been waiting for me on purpose. I left the truck door open behind me. There was no reason to close it. Whatever came next, I was not planning to leave quietly. The porch light was off, but the lamp burning in that one upstairs window threw enough glow down the front of the house to see by. I crossed the lawn at a pace I had not moved at in years, my knees complaining with every stride, and climbed the 3 stone steps to the front door. I did not get the chance to knock. The door opened before my hand reached it, slow and deliberate, the way a door opens when someone has been standing on the other side, listening to footsteps approach. Jocelyn Houston stood in the frame. I want to be precise about what I saw because it told me more than anything she said afterward. It was past 1 in the morning. Her hair was set. Her blouse was pressed the collar sitting exactly where a collar is supposed to sit. There was lipstick on her mouth, the kind a woman applies in front of a mirror, not the kind that survives 4 hours of sleep. She had not been woken by anything. She had been waiting. Ezekiel. She said my name the way she might read a line off a cue card, warm on the surface and empty underneath. It's the middle of the night. Where is my daughter? I did not phrase it as a question, and she did not answer it as one. Meghan is resting. She had a difficult evening. Jocelyn's hand came to rest on the doorframe, not gripping it, just resting there, casual, as a woman leaning against a fence post to admire her own garden. It would be best for everyone if you came back in the morning when she's more herself. She called me. Something happened to that call. She's been under a great deal of strain lately, Ezekiel. You know how demanding her teaching schedule has been. Jocelyn's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. I think you're letting your imagination run away with you at an hour when imaginations tend to do that. I have sat across negotiating tables from men who lied for a living, men who could look you dead in the eye and tell you a burning building was structurally sound. I know what it looks like when someone is reciting a version of events instead of remembering one. Jocelyn's sentences came out too smooth, too evenly spaced, like she had rehearsed the shape of them before I ever pulled through that gate. That was when I heard it. Thin, high, coming from somewhere above us, muffled by a closed door and a hallway between us, but unmistakable all the same. A child crying, the exhausted, hiccuping kind of crying that comes after a long stretch of being frightened, alone in the dark. Harmony. Something in my chest moved that had nothing to do with strategy or negotiation. I have carried that child on my shoulders through 3 county fairs. I taught her to whistle with a blade of grass between her thumbs last summer, out behind my own house, both of us laughing so hard we could barely hold the note. The sound coming down that staircase did not belong to a little girl having a restless night. It belonged to a little girl who had been alone with her fear for longer than any 7-year-old should be. Jocelyn's expression did not change, but her hand tightened on the doorframe. Just slightly, just enough that I saw it. The child is fine, she said before I had asked. She's had a restless night. Children pick up on tension in a house. It's nothing that concerns you tonight. That's my granddaughter crying behind a locked door, and you're telling me it doesn't concern me? I'm telling you that walking in here and making a scene will not help Meghan, and it will certainly not help Harmony. Her voice dropped, and for the first time I heard something underneath the polish, something closer to a warning than a suggestion. You should go home, Ezekiel. Come back tomorrow when tempers have settled. I thought about the 8 or 9 seconds it would take to explain myself, to lay out the phone call and the silence and the sound of a hand closing over a mouth, and I understood in that moment that none of it would matter. She was not standing in that doorway to have a conversation. She was standing there to buy time, and every second I spent arguing with her was a second she was winning. 40 years in commercial law teaches a man one thing above every other. When someone hands you a contract and refuses to let you read it, that is the entire negotiation right there. You do not need to see the fine print to know it does not favor you. I did not raise my voice. I did not put a hand on her. I simply stepped forward the way I have stepped past 100 junior associates who thought a closed office door meant a closed conversation, and I moved through the space where she had been standing before she had decided whether to hold her ground. Jocelyn made a short, sharp sound behind me, something between a gasp and a command, and I heard her heels start moving fast across the marble of the entryway. I did not turn around. I was already at the base of the staircase, one hand on the banister, looking up into the dark of the second floor, following the sound of my granddaughter's crying toward whatever it was this family had spent the last hour trying to keep me from seeing. The stairs at the Houston estate curve wide and shallow, built for descending in an evening gown, not for climbing 2 at a time in work boots at 1 in the morning. I took them anyway, one hand dragging along the banister, Jocelyn's voice rising behind me somewhere near the front door, a string of words I did not stop to translate. Threats, warnings, it did not matter which. The crying grew louder as I reached the second floor, then cut off hard the way a sound cuts off when a door swings shut between it and you. I followed the last direction it had come from, down a hallway lined with photographs of a family that had never once invited me to stand close enough to be in one. The door at the end was locked. I did not knock. I put my shoulder into it once to test the give, felt the frame answer back solid old wood and a deadbolt doing exactly what they were built to do. 31 years behind a desk had not erased what came before it. My father raised me on a farm outside Marshall, and there is a particular way you learn to move a stuck gate or a swollen barn door when you grow up on land that fights you back. I stepped away, planted my boot below the handle, and drove it forward. The frame split on the second try. The door swung in and struck the wall hard enough to rattle a picture frame off its nail somewhere behind me. The room was dark except for a nightlight, glowing faint blue near the baseboard, the kind you buy for a child, not an adult, though this was plainly a guest room, sparse and impersonal, nothing on the walls. Meghan lay across the bed on top of the covers, still in the blouse she must have been wearing hours earlier, one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress at an angle that made my stomach drop before I had even crossed the room. I was at her side before I had decided to move. Her breathing was there, but shallow, the kind of shallow that makes a man count the seconds between one breath and the next without meaning to. I pressed 2 fingers to her wrist and found a pulse too slow, too faint, and I held that wrist a beat longer than I needed to because letting go of it felt like admitting how frightened I was. 9 years ago, I sat beside a different bed in a different room and told myself I would have caught it sooner if I had only been paying closer attention, if I had read the small print of Renata's tiredness the way I read everything else in my life. I did not say any of that out loud now. I only counted her pulse again, slower this time, my thumb pressed flat against skin gone cool at the edges, and made myself a promise I had no intention of breaking twice. That was when I saw her forearms. Bruising dark and already deepening toward purple, wrapped around both wrists in a pattern I recognized before I let myself think the word for it. Not the scattered marks of someone who had fallen. 4 narrow bands and a wider mark beneath each, the specific geometry of fingers of a grip held and held and held past the point where a person stops fighting it. I have spent a career reading the difference between an accident and a decision. This was not an accident. She's had a difficult night. I did not hear him come in. Quentin stood in the doorway I had just broken, and the first thing I noticed, the thing that lodged itself under my ribs and stayed there, was that he looked exactly like a man who had slept undisturbed until 60 seconds ago and then dressed carefully before coming to find out what the noise was about. His collar sat straight, his hair held its part, There was no crease anywhere on him, no sign at all of a husband who had been startled awake by his father-in-law breaking down a door. "Call an ambulance," I said. "Now!" "Gerald," he caught himself. "Ezekiel, let's not overreact. She gets like this sometimes when the stress builds up. She'll sleep it off." "Look at her arms and tell me that again." Something crossed his face there and gone so fast, I might have imagined it if I had not spent 3 decades reading exactly that kind of flicker across 100 negotiating tables. Not concern, calculation. A man doing arithmetic on how much of the truth a room could survive hearing. "This is a family matter," he said, his voice smoothing itself back into something reasonable. "I appreciate that you're worried, but bringing in paramedics, police, all of that, it's not what Meghan needs right now. It would only make things worse for her. Worse than this. You don't understand the whole situation." I stood up from the bed slowly, and I made myself look at him the way I used to look at an opposing counsel across a table when I already had the winning clause folded in my breast pocket and he did not yet know it existed. "Then explain it to me," I said, "right now, because in about 10 seconds I'm calling 911 myself and you can spend the rest of tonight explaining the whole situation to whoever answers that call instead." Quentin did not move from the doorway. For a long moment, neither of us said anything, and in that silence I could hear Jocelyn's footsteps finally reaching the top of the stairs behind him, and somewhere further down the hall, faint and hiccuping Harmony had started crying again. I did not wait for an answer that was never coming. I bent down, worked one arm beneath Meghan's knees and the other behind her shoulders, and lifted her off that bed the way I used to lift her off the porch swing when she fell asleep out there as a girl, back when she weighed nothing and trusted completely that whoever was carrying her would not drop her. She weighed almost nothing now too, and that was its own kind of terrible. "You cannot just take her out of this house." Quentin had found his voice again, stepping into my path as I crossed toward the door. "I'm calling Dr. LeBlanc. He knows her medical history. He can be here in 20 minutes and handle this properly without turning it into a public spectacle. She needs a hospital, not a family friend with a bag of pills." "Ezekiel!" Jocelyn's voice came from the top of the stairs, cool and even, the tone of a woman correcting a subordinate. "You are not thinking clearly. Let Quentin call someone who actually knows her case." I did not stop walking. I have negotiated across boardroom tables with men who tried to slow a deal down the exact same way, offering a friendlier, more convenient alternative right at the moment speed mattered most. The offer is never about convenience. It is about control. Quentin followed me down the stairs close enough that I could hear him breathing hard behind me, and by the time I reached the front door, he had shifted tactics entirely. "I'm coming with you," he said. "She's my wife. I have every right to be there." I did not have the time to argue him out of the passenger seat, and some cold part of me decided it was better to have him where I could watch him than loose in that house making calls I could not hear. I laid Meghan across the back seat of my truck, buckled the belt low across her hips, the way you do with someone who cannot hold themselves upright, and pulled my coat over her before Quentin had even finished folding himself into the front. The drive to Mission Hospital took 11 minutes. I do not remember obeying a single speed limit along the way. Quentin did not say much in that truck, which told me almost as much as if he had talked the whole way. He sat rigid in the passenger seat with his phone in both hands, thumbs moving fast over the screen, the glow of it lighting his face from below in a way that made him look nothing like a frightened husband and everything like a man managing a crisis on a schedule. Once at a red light, I ran anyway. I caught him glance back at Meghan in the mirror, and there was nothing in that glance I would call love. There was arithmetic. I carried her through the emergency doors myself, shouting for help before the automatic doors had finished opening, and a team in scrubs took her from my arms onto a gurney with the kind of practice speed that told me they had seen this exact kind of stillness before and knew exactly how frightened it should make everyone in the room. I did not get more than 4 words into explaining what had happened before a man in a white coat came around the corner of the nurse's station, moving with an unhurried confidence that struck me wrong before I had even read his badge. Dr. LeBlanc. He walked past me the way a man walks past furniture and went directly to Quentin, one hand landing on his shoulder like they had done this before. "Quentin, your mother called ahead. I have a private room ready." His voice was pitched low professional, entirely too relaxed for a woman who had just come through those doors barely breathing. "We'll keep this contained and handle it properly." I stepped between them before either man could take another step toward the treatment doors. "I want a full blood panel," I said, holding his gaze. "Every substance in her system documented, and I want those bruises on her arms photographed and examined by someone who is not on this family's payroll." LeBlanc's eyes moved over me, the unhurried way a man looks at something he has already decided he does not need to take seriously. "Mr. Gates, I can assure you the standard of care here is beyond reproach." He gave a small, patient nod toward Quentin. "That said, Quentin is her legal next of kin. Her treatment decisions will be discussed with him." Before I could answer that, a nurse pressed a clipboard into my hands. Not LeBlanc's, not Quentin's, mine. The way hospital staff do when they are simply trying to keep a chaotic room moving. I looked down at the top page without meaning to, and the heading printed across it in bold official type stopped every other thought in my head. Healthcare Power of Attorney. Signed, dated 3 weeks earlier. Meghan's signature sat at the bottom of the page, unmistakably hers, granting Quentin Houston total and uncontested authority over every medical decision that would be made in that building tonight. I have read thousands of contracts in my life, and I know the particular cold feeling of holding one that was built to close a door in your face. This was that feeling dressed up in a hospital letterhead instead of a corporate seal. I did not say any of that out loud. I folded the clipboard closed and kept my face as still as I have ever kept it across any negotiating table, because the moment they saw how much that page had rattled me was the moment they would stop making mistakes in front of me. LeBlanc walked me a few feet down the corridor, away from the treatment room doors, the same way a man walks a client into a smaller conference room when he wants to control the size of an argument. "I understand this is difficult to witness," he said, folding his hands in front of him. "But I want to give you an accurate picture, since you're clearly a man who values facts." He glanced once at Quentin before continuing. "Meghan has been under significant psychological strain for several months. Panic attacks primarily, sleep disturbance. It's not uncommon in her profession, working with young children in an underfunded school system. She has never mentioned any of that to me. People rarely tell their fathers everything," LeBlanc said with the small, patient smile of a man delivering a line he has delivered before. "Tonight, from what Quentin has described, she experienced what appears to be an acute dissociative episode. Disorientation, combativeness. In cases like this, physical restraint is sometimes the only thing standing between a patient and serious self-harm." I looked past him at Quentin, who had arranged his face into something that resembled grief the way a photocopy resembles a signature, close enough to pass a glance, wrong in every detail if you look directly at it. "She was fighting me," Quentin said quietly, staring at some fixed point on the floor. "I had to hold her down until she wore herself out. I know how it looks. I know how it must have looked to you, breaking that door in and finding her like that. I wish there had been another way." "When did this start?" I asked. "The panic attacks." "October." Quentin answered too quickly, the way a man answers when he has rehearsed the timeline rather than lived it. "Right around the district's budget review. The school cut 2 teaching assistants from her building, and she absorbed the difference. She stopped sleeping. She started missing dinners without explanation." He looked up at me with what was supposed to read as helplessness. "I should have told you sooner. I kept thinking I could handle it myself." "You didn't think her own father should know his daughter was falling apart?" "I thought I was protecting her privacy." His voice cracked on the word privacy, right on cue, the kind of crack an actor practices until it sounds involuntary. "She would have hated you seeing her like this, Ezekiel. She's proud. You know that better than anyone." It was, I will admit, a well-built story. Every piece of it slotted into the next without a seam showing. The strain of her job explained the panic attack. The panic attack explained the restraint. The restraint explained the bruising. The power of attorney, conveniently signed 3 weeks prior, explained why none of this needed to leave this hallway. A contract has a particular kind of perfection when someone has had time to draft every clause in advance, and this story had exactly that kind of perfection. Too much of it. What was she taking? I asked. For the panic attacks. A mild anti-anxiety prescription, LeBlanc said. Nothing unusual. I can pull her chart if that would put your mind at ease. Please do. He did not move to do it. Instead, he glanced at his watch, an unhurried little gesture meant to signal that my request had registered somewhere on a list well below whatever he considered urgent, and told me the attending physician would be out shortly with an update. I did not argue further. Arguing tells the other side exactly which nerve you have found, and I was not ready to hand either of them that information yet. I thanked him, which seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation would have, and asked if I might sit with the paperwork while I waited, purely to have something to occupy my hands. LeBlanc handed the folder back without hesitation. That told me something, too. A man who is hiding something in the fine print does not usually let you sit with the fine print unsupervised. Either he believed the story was airtight enough to survive scrutiny, or he had never expected anyone in this family to actually read past the signature line. I found a hard plastic chair against the wall, the kind bolted down to discourage anyone from getting too comfortable, and I opened the folder across my knees. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, the particular hum of a bulb close to the end of its life, and somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped in a rhythm I made myself stop listening to. I sat there for a moment before opening to the first page, and I thought about how many times in my career I had watched a client walk into my office convinced a bad contract was airtight simply because it had a lot of pages. Length is not rigor. Confidence is not accuracy. The people who build a story this smooth are usually the people who have never once imagined someone taking the time to actually check it. I turned to the first page of The Power of Attorney and started reading the way I have read every document that has ever mattered in my life. Slowly. From the top. Trusting nothing until I had traced it back to its source with my own eyes. I read contracts the way some men read scripture, which is to say, I do not trust a single sentence until I have checked what sentence came before it and what sentence follows. The first page of The Power of Attorney was unremarkable, the standard boilerplate granting Quentin authority over medical decisions in the event Meghan was deemed unable to make them herself. Page 2 was where the document earned its purpose. A single paragraph, buried in dense legal language, cited a formal capacity evaluation as the basis for the arrangement, the medical determination that justified handing one adult total control over another. I reached into my coat pocket without thinking about it and pulled out Renata's reading glasses. I do not need them. My eyes are still good enough at 69 that most people find that unsettling. But there is something in the weight of those wire frames against my nose, some old habit from watching her wear them at our kitchen table late at night, bent over a stack of estate documents with a red pen in her hand, that slows my reading down to the pace hers used to run. Slower. More suspicious. Renata used to say the truth was never in the sentence itself. It was in the gap between two sentences that were supposed to agree with each other and did not. I found the gap on my second pass through page 2. The Power of Attorney was dated and signed 3 weeks earlier, a Tuesday. The capacity evaluation the document cited as its legal basis, the formal medical determination that Meghan required this arrangement, was dated 11 days after that signature. I read the two dates a third time to make certain I had not simply misread a digit in bad hospital lighting. I had not. A document cannot rest its authority on an evaluation that had not yet happened when it was signed. Meghan could not have consented to an arrangement justified by a diagnosis that, according to the paper in my hands, did not exist yet on the day she supposedly signed it. Someone had built this in a hurry. Or someone had built it for a different date entirely and forgotten to make the second page match the first. I sat very still in that plastic chair and let the noise of the hallway keep moving around me, a gurney wheel squeaking somewhere, a phone ringing twice at the nurse's station before someone picked it up. None of it touched me. I have felt this particular stillness perhaps a dozen times in 31 years, the exact moment a case turns, when a room full of confident people has no idea that the floor beneath their story just gave way. I thought of Renata leaning across our kitchen table late at night, tapping one fingernail against a paragraph that did not match the one above it, saying nothing, letting me find the error myself, because she believed a lawyer who found his own mistakes learned faster than one who was simply told about them. I did not let myself think in that hallway about the last document I had ever read across from her, the one where I had trusted the summary instead of reading every page myself, the one that told me her decline was manageable when it was not. I closed that door in my mind the way I close a folder I am not ready to open. There would be time for that reckoning later. Tonight, there was only the reading in front of me, and I intended to do it properly this time. I did not smile. I did not stand up and confront anyone with what I had found. A man who shows his hand at the table loses the table, and I had spent 31 years watching opposing counsel make exactly that mistake out of pride or exhaustion or simple disbelief that the other side had actually done its homework. I was not going to hand Quentin Houston that particular gift. I closed the folder slowly, the way a man closes a book he has decided is not worth finishing, and slid Renata's glasses back into my coat pocket. When I looked up, Quentin was watching me from across the hallway, with an expression that wanted very badly to look like concern.
"Everything all right, Ezekiel?"
"You're right," I said, and I let my shoulders drop the way a man's shoulders drop when he has finally run out of fight. "I'm just an old man who panicked when the phone rang. I don't know the first thing about medical decisions. I should let you two handle this properly." Something in his face eased the particular relief of a man who believes he has just won. "There's a hotel not far from here," LeBlanc offered, appearing at Quentin's shoulder as though summoned. "Or you could head home and rest. We'll call you the moment there's anything to report." "I think I'll do just that," I said. "Drive somewhere quiet, clear my head." The lie came easier than I expected, and I understood standing there that this was the first of what would need to be a great many lies if I intended to find out who had drafted that second page and why. I have negotiated for other people's fortunes my entire professional life without once needing to deceive anyone I loved. It did not sit comfortably. It did not need to sit comfortably. It only needed to work. I stood and walked back toward the waiting room chairs like a man retreating, the folder tucked loosely under one arm. I did not look back to see whether he believed me. I already knew he did. Confident men rarely check twice on a fight they think they have already finished, and I intended to let him go on believing exactly that for as long as it took me to find out who else had put their name on that second page. I did not sleep. I sat at my own kitchen table until the sky outside the window went from black to the flat gray that passes for dawn in the mountains in late winter, watching the ridgeline east of the house resolve itself slowly out of the dark, the way it has every morning for 30 years, and at 7 o'clock exactly, I called Mission Hospital and asked for an update on my daughter. The woman on the line put me on hold for 4 minutes, came back and told me, with the careful, rehearsed regret of someone reading from a script written by a hospital attorney, that patient information could only be released to Meghan Houston's designated healthcare proxy. I told her I understood the policy. I did not tell her I had spent half the night reading the exact document that made that policy possible, and that I already knew it was worth less than the paper it was printed on. I called back twice more under different pretenses, once as a family friend, once claiming I had left medication at the house that Meghan needed. Both calls ended the same way, a polite wall of privacy language that told me nothing except that whoever had built this arrangement had built it to withstand exactly this kind of pressure. So I stopped asking politely and started reading instead. I drove to the hospital myself and found a nurse coming off her overnight shift in the parking garage, a woman in scrubs printed with cartoon sunflowers, keys already in her hand. I introduced myself honestly as Meghan's father and asked only one question: had my daughter still been in that building when her shift ended? She hesitated the particular way people hesitate when they know something they are not supposed to say and want very badly to say it anyway. She was transferred out around 5, the nurse said, glancing once toward the entrance behind her. Private transport came for her. Mrs. Houston had already arranged everything ahead of time. Paperwork was ready before the transport even pulled up. She caught herself then, the way people catch themselves after handing over more than they meant to, and added, "I really shouldn't be talking about this." "You've already helped more than you know," I told her, and meant it. Arranged ahead of time. Paperwork ready before the transport arrived. I turned that phrase over the entire drive home because a family in genuine crisis does not have transfer paperwork sitting finished and waiting. Only a family that had planned the crisis in advance would have that. I spent the next 2 hours at my own desk with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, doing the kind of work I used to bill $400 an hour to do for other people. North Carolina keeps its corporate filings public, and it did not take long once I started searching licensed behavioral health facilities within an hour of Asheville to find the name I was looking for buried in a registered agent filing 3 years old. I have spent a career learning that the people who hide something rarely hide it well in the places nobody thinks to look. Corporate registries are the least glamorous public records in the state, and precisely because of that, the people who want to bury an ownership stake tend to bury it there rather than somewhere flashier. I worked through licensing databases, tax parcel records, and a state healthcare directory, cross-referenced against every facility within 60 miles the same patient. Unglamorous method I used to use, tracking down shell companies for clients who had been cheated by their own business partners. Pisgah Ridge Behavioral Health, a private residential facility tucked into the hills east of the city. Listed among its founding principles in language dense enough that most people would scroll straight past it was Jocelyn Houston. I sat back from the screen and let that settle. Meghan had not been sent to some anonymous facility chosen in a moment of panic. She had been sent to a building her own mother-in-law partly owned. While I had that database open, one more detail caught my eye, small enough that I nearly missed it. A separate filing, dated only 4 days earlier, showed Quinton's investment firm had signed a new contract with a private security company out of Charlotte, the kind of firm that handles corporate protection details rather than home alarm systems. 4 days earlier, before any of tonight had happened. I did not yet know what a man in his position needed with that kind of security, but I wrote the company's name down on the same legal pad where I had written Pisgah Ridge because, in my experience, nothing a man arranges quietly in advance turns out to be unrelated to what comes after. I picked up my phone and called the only person I knew who could help me find out what was actually happening behind the walls of a building I had no legal right to walk into. Renata used to tell me that the difference between a lawyer and an investigator was that a lawyer only asks the questions a document allows him to ask. I had spent 9 years since her death half believing that particular distinction did not apply to me anymore. Sitting at that desk with a legal pad full of names I had no authority to act on, I understood I was about to find out how wrong I had been. The phone was still in my hand when I set it back down. There was one more thing I needed to check before I called anyone, and it was not sitting in a state database. It was sitting in my own study, in a safe I had poured the concrete for myself 20 years ago, and I was not about to make a phone call I could not undo before I had read it again with my own eyes. I knelt on the rug in front of that safe, the way I have knelt 100 times, worked the dial through its combination, and pulled out the thick manila envelope where I keep the documents Renata assembled before the cancer took her final say in things. She had been meticulous about that estate, the way she was meticulous about everything, and among the deeds and the retirement paperwork was the file I was looking for now. The trust she had built for our daughter with a financial attorney, tougher than half the litigators I ever faced in a courtroom. I carried it to my desk and untied the string closure with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. I had read this trust before years ago in the numb weeks after Renata's funeral, and I remembered the broad strokes of it the way you remember a story someone told you once at a dinner party. $8 million, grown from an inheritance Renata had kept scrupulously separate from my law practice for our entire marriage. Overseen by an attorney named Priya Nandi, tough as a fence post and twice as immovable. Locked until Meghan turned 35. What I had not remembered, because I had never needed to before, was the second beneficiary clause buried 3 pages in. Renata had structured the trust so that a portion released to Meghan at maturity, and a separate smaller portion was held in a subtrust for any grandchild born before that maturity date, accessible only through the primary beneficiary's legal guardian, if that beneficiary was ever found incapacitated. I read the clause twice, then a third time, tracing the language with one finger, the way I used to trace contract language for junior associates who had missed something obvious. It meant Harmony had money in that trust too. Not a great deal on its own, but enough combined with Meghan's share to matter a great deal to a man drowning in debt. I sat with that fact longer than I meant to. Harmony is 7 years old. She thinks a trust fund is a word for the kind of chest pirates bury on beaches, and somewhere in a locked room of legal language her grandmother had written years before either of us knew this danger was coming, her name sat next to her mother's, tied to the exact same lever someone was now trying to pull. And it meant something else, something that turned my stomach cold the moment I understood it fully. To access either portion through incapacity, the guardian named would need to hold legal authority over both beneficiaries, not just one, not just Meghan, Harmony as well. I sat back in my chair and looked at the two names on that page for a long time. This was never only about controlling my daughter's medical decisions. If Quentin wanted that trust, all of it, he needed guardianship over my granddaughter too. That was not a detail a man overlooks by accident. That was a plan built with full knowledge of exactly what this document said, which meant someone had read this trust as carefully as I was reading it now. Someone who had access to Renata's estate paperwork long before last night. Renata used to say a trust was only as strong as the imagination of the person trying to break it. She had built this one to survive a divorce, a bankruptcy, even a death. Every ordinary catastrophe a family lawyer plans around. I do not think either of us ever imagined she was also building it to survive an attempted kidnapping, dressed up as a mental health crisis. I found myself sitting alone at that desk, grateful in a way that had nothing to do with relief for a woman 9 years gone, who had thought 2 steps further ahead than either of us ever gave her credit for. I thought of Jocelyn Houston, who I had watched at 3 years of family gatherings, quietly correct catering invoices and audit charity ledgers herself rather than hand the task to an accountant. A woman who trusted her own eyes over anyone else's summary. I made a note of that on my legal pad beside Pisgah Ridge and the security contract, not because I had proof of anything yet, but because in my experience, the person who insists on reading every line herself is usually the person who already knows which lines matter. I picked the phone back up and dialed a number I had not called in 5 years. A retired detective who had helped me once before when a corrupt supplier tried to bleed my old firm dry through a chain of shell invoices, and who had told me at the end of that case to call him again if I ever needed a man who knew how to walk through walls the law would not let me walk through myself.
"Benson," I said when the gruff voice on the other end picked up on the 3rd ring.
"It's Ezekiel Gates. I need your help. I've got a situation and I need someone who knows how to find the truth in places I don't have the standing to walk into myself." There was a pause, then a low, familiar chuckle. "Tell me where and when, Ezekiel." Benson was already in the corner booth when I got to the diner, working on a cup of coffee he had clearly been nursing since before I called, his silver mustache twitching the way it does when he is turning something over in his head before he says it out loud. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, 5 years and a divorce older, but the eyes had not changed. Those eyes never stop working a room, even when the rest of him is sitting still. "You look like a man who broke a door down last night," he said by way of greeting. I did. I laid it all out for him across that scratched Formica table. The phone call, the bruises, the power of attorney with its 2 mismatched dates, the transfer to a facility his own mother-in-law partly owned, the double beneficiary clause buried in a trust my dead wife had built to survive exactly this kind of attack. Benson listened without interrupting. The particular skill of a man who spent 30 years taking statements from people whose lives had just come apart. And when I finished, he set his coffee down slowly. Whoever built that power of attorney knew what they were doing legally and got sloppy on the dates, he said. That tells me 2 things. 1, they were moving fast. 2, they had a real attorney draft the frame of it, and then somebody less careful filled in the specifics after the fact. Find who filled in the blanks, you'll find who's really running this. I had already reached the same conclusion on my own kitchen table at 4 in the morning, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel less like a fear and more like a plan. "I want to bring Keon in," Benson said, already pulling his phone from his jacket. "You remember Keon Simpson?" I did. Keon had been a junior associate at my old firm 15 years ago, quiet, precise, the kind of young lawyer who would rather spend 3 extra hours tracing a discrepancy than accept an explanation that almost added up. He had left corporate practice to build a forensic accounting shop, the kind of business that exists specifically to find money someone has worked very hard to hide. Benson put him on speaker. "Ezekiel." Keon's voice came through flat and unhurried, the same voice I remembered. Benson gave me the short version. "Tell me about the son-in-law." I told him what little I knew, that Quentin ran an investment firm inherited from his father, that he had seemed rattled beneath the polish the moment I pressed him at the hospital that a man does not manufacture a legal trap this elaborate over a medical disagreement. "Men don't build machinery like that to control a spouse," Keon said. "They build it to control money. If there's a financial motive under this, I'll find it, but I'll need something to pull the thread from. A name inside the company, someone who signs things." Benson and I looked at each other across the table. "D'Angelo Trevino," I said. "Quentin's chief financial officer. I've met him twice at company functions. He always struck me as a man carrying something heavier than his job title." "That's a start," Keon said. "Financial officers under pressure leave a trail even when they're careful. I'll see what's public on the firm's filings tonight and call you both tomorrow." The call ended, and Benson pulled a fresh stick of spearmint gum from his jacket pocket, unwrapped it with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, and folded it into his mouth. I had forgotten that particular habit of his until I saw it again, the way he chewed slow and steady whenever a case was starting to actually interest him, as if his jaw needed something to do while the rest of him thought. "I did a slow drive past the Houston place on my way here," he said. "Wanted to get a feel for the property before we go any further. And there's a black sedan parked about 200 yards down from the gate, engine off, windows tinted dark enough that I couldn't get a look at the driver. Not a patrol car, not a delivery vehicle. It sat there the whole 10 minutes I circled the block, and the plate came back registered to a private security firm out of Charlotte." "The same firm. The contract I had found buried in that filing 4 days before any of this happened." "They're watching the house," I said. "They're watching something," Benson corrected. "Could be the house, could be watching for anybody who comes sniffing around asking questions. A father-in-law with a broken door shouldn't be asking." He held my eyes for a long moment. "Ezekiel, if Quentin hired protection before last night even happened, that's not a man reacting to a family crisis. That's a man who knew a crisis was coming and got ready for it in advance." I thought of the 4-day-old filing on my legal pad sitting right next to Pisgah Ridge, and the trust documents, 3 separate pieces of paper that had nothing to do with each other on their face and everything to do with each other underneath. "Whatever we do next," I said, "we do it assuming somebody is already looking for us before we've made a single move." Benson nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had called him that morning, I saw something harden in his face that had nothing to do with age or tiredness. It was the look of a man who had just decided a case was worth more of his time than he had originally planned to give it. He worked the gum once, twice, then stopped chewing altogether, which I would come to learn was the surest sign that Benson Orozco had stopped thinking of something as a favor and started thinking of it as a fight. Keon called back the next afternoon, and I could hear in the first 3 words that something had already gone sideways. "I made contact with D'Angelo," he said. "Careful contact. Called his office line, told him I was doing due diligence for a client, considering an investment with the firm, asked a few general questions about their compliance structure, nothing that should have raised an alarm on its own. But he called me back 40 minutes later from a personal cell number off the record, voice shaking, told me he couldn't talk long, said things at the firm had gotten strange this week, that Quentin had pulled him into 2 closed-door meetings about a security audit of internal communications, and that he was scared enough to nearly hang up on me twice before he finished the sentence. I sat with that for a moment. A man does not call an unfamiliar accountant back on his personal cell 40 minutes after a routine due diligence question unless something in that question had already been sitting on a nerve. He's afraid of something specific, I said. He's afraid of something recent, Keon corrected. My guess is my call landed the same week Quentin started tightening the screws on his own people, which means either I got unlucky with timing or somebody already told the firm to watch for exactly this kind of inquiry. What did he say exactly, before he hung up? Not much, just that he couldn't keep doing his job in good conscience much longer, and that he wished somebody would ask him the right question before it was too late to answer it honestly. Keon let that sit on the line a moment. That's not the kind of thing a man says about routine compliance paperwork, Ezekiel. That's the kind of thing a man says when he's been carrying something heavy for a long time and just found out somebody might finally be listening. I did not learn the rest of it until much later, pieced together from what D'Angelo himself eventually told me, and from records Keon pulled after the fact. But I have put it together here the way it actually happened, because a man deserves to understand the whole shape of the trap before I explain how we got out of it. Quentin had received 2 reports within an hour of each other that Thursday afternoon. The first came from the security firm out of Charlotte, a routine surveillance summary, noting an unidentified sedan that had circled the Houston property twice in 2 days. Information Benson's slow drive-by had handed them, without either of us knowing it. The second came from his own head of IT, flagging an external call into D'Angelo Trevino's direct line from a small forensic accounting firm, followed immediately by an unusual spike in outbound calls from D'Angelo's personal cell. Quentin sat with both reports open on his desk, according to what I would later reconstruct, and did not need long to connect them. A stranger watching the house, a stranger calling his CFO, 2 threads pulled from entirely different directions that both led, if you followed them back, far enough to the same broken bedroom door from 2 nights before. He is said to have read the surveillance summary first twice, tapping one finger against the paragraph describing the sedan's plate number, and then set it beside the IT report, the way a man lines up 2 pieces of a puzzle he already suspects will fit before he has actually pressed them together. According to D'Angelo, who described the scene to me weeks later, with the particular flat calm of a man who has already decided to stop protecting someone, Quentin did not raise his voice at all that afternoon. He simply closed his office door, poured 2 fingers of bourbon he did not drink, and made 3 phone calls in the span of 20 minutes, each one shorter and colder than the last. He is said to have smiled when he closed the second report, the particular smile of a man who believes he still has more moves available than his opponent does. Whatever fear had cracked through his composure at the hospital, whatever had made his hands unsteady in that hallway, none of it survived contact with the discovery that his father-in-law was building a case against him in the shadows rather than through the courts. A quiet threat in Quentin's world was a threat he knew exactly how to handle. By 4 that afternoon, he had a call in to Marcus Webb, the family attorney, who had drafted half the paperwork protecting the Houston fortune for 2 decades, a man known around the Asheville bar for filing emergency motions with the same casual efficiency other lawyers reserved for renewing a parking permit. I did not know any of that yet when Keon's call ended. What I knew was simpler and colder. Somewhere in the last 24 hours, without meaning to, we had made enough noise for them to hear us coming. I sat at my kitchen table for a long while after hanging up, turning the situation over the way I used to turn over a settlement offer that had come in faster and cleaner than it had any right to. Speed like that in an opposing party usually means one of 2 things. Either they are frightened and reacting, or they are prepared and have simply been waiting for a reason to move. I did not yet know which one described Quentin Houston. I only knew that whichever it was, the quiet, careful phase of this fight had just ended, and neither Benson nor I had gotten to choose when. The papers arrived at my door on Friday morning, hand-delivered by a process server who would not meet my eyes while he did it, which told me everything about how he felt, handing an old man an emergency restraining order before 9 in the morning. I read it standing in my own doorway, still in my coat, because I did not trust myself to sit down first. Marcus Webb had built it well. The petition cited the broken bedroom door as evidence of escalating erratic behavior, described my questions at the hospital as aggressive and destabilizing, and attached a statement from Quentin describing my presence as a source of ongoing psychological distress to a minor child who had, according to the filing, been having nightmares since the incident. A judge I had never appeared before had signed a temporary order the previous evening, ex parte, no hearing required for an emergency filing of this kind, which meant I had been stripped of contact with my own granddaughter before I ever had the chance to say a word in a courtroom. I know this maneuver. I have used versions of it myself years ago for clients who needed breathing room before the other side's evidence could catch up to them. It is legal. It is effective. It is designed to buy exactly the kind of silence Quentin needed while whatever else he was arranging finished arranging itself. I called an old colleague within the hour, a family law attorney I trusted, and read her the petition line by line over the phone, while she made small, disapproving sounds at the weaker parts of Webb's drafting. "It's thin," she said when I finished. "Thin enough that I could probably get you an expedited hearing inside 2 weeks instead of the usual month. But Ezekiel, I have to be honest with you. Ex parte orders like this are built to survive exactly the kind of challenge you're about to bring. Judges don't like reversing themselves on child welfare, even when the underlying petition is weak. You may win the hearing. You will lose the 2 weeks in between." She confirmed what I already knew sitting in my chest like a stone. I could contest it. I could request an expedited hearing. But an emergency order like this typically holds for 10 to 14 days before a judge revisits it. And there was no version of the law that would let me stand within 500 feet of my granddaughter's school before then. I did not go home after that call. I told myself I was simply driving the way a man drives when his hands need something to do that his mind cannot manage on its own. And somehow, that driving put me on the street across from Harmony's elementary school at exactly 2:40 in the afternoon, well outside the restricted distance, close enough only to see the front doors and the yellow buses idling along the curb. I have no defense for why I stayed. I only know that when the doors opened and the second-grade line filed out into the cold small coats and small backpacks, I found her almost immediately, the particular way a grandfather's eye finds one child in a crowd of 40 without needing to search for her. Harmony saw me too. She lit up the way she always does, one hand shooting into the air, and she called something I could not hear across that distance, but did not need to because I have heard her call my name across playgrounds and porches for 7 years, and I know the exact shape her mouth makes when she says it. She started toward the street before her teacher's hand closed gently around her shoulder, redirecting her toward the bus line, and Harmony looked back once, confused, still waving, not understanding why her grandfather was standing across the street instead of walking over the way he always did. I did not wave back the way I wanted to. I lifted one hand, held it there a moment, and let it fall because anything more might have looked to anyone watching that street with a Charlotte security firm's patience exactly like the kind of behavior a petition like Marcus Webb's was built to describe. I do not know how long I stood there after the buses pulled away. Long enough that the cold worked its way through my coat. Long enough that I stopped pretending to myself I had somewhere else to be. I have built my entire life around the belief that if I read a thing carefully enough, thoroughly enough, before it happened, I could keep the people I loved from being hurt by it. I read Renata's chart summaries instead of every page and lost her to a decline I might have caught sooner. I had read every page of Meghan's power of attorney inside a single night, and still could not stop a stranger with a badge from handing me a piece of paper that made it illegal for me to cross a street toward my own grandchild. Being right about the document had not been enough. I stood on that sidewalk and let myself feel the particular useless weight of that fact for exactly as long as it took the wind to go through my coat a second time, and then I put it away because there was nothing on that sidewalk left to read. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I did not recognize the number of text from an unfamiliar Asheville exchange 3 lines long, and I read it standing on that empty sidewalk with the school behind me and my granddaughter already gone. "A friend at Mission General gave me your number. I work at Pisgah Ridge. I need to talk to you about your daughter, and it cannot wait until visiting hours." I read it twice, Then a third time, the cold forgotten entirely. I called Benson before I had finished reading it a fourth. 2 days after Novali's first message, Benson had turned an empty storage unit off Sweeten Creek Road into something that looked less like a rented warehouse bay and more like the war room of a much larger operation than 3 tired men and a legal pad. Folding tables, a whiteboard he had bought secondhand from a closing daycare, the ghost of a hand-drawn alphabet still faintly visible under the wiped surface if the light hit it wrong. An extension cord running to a space heater that fought a losing battle against the cold coming through the metal walls. I had spent 31 years working out of an office with my name on brass letters bolted to a marble lobby, and there was something almost clarifying about ending up here instead, in a building that smelled like motor oil and cardboard, doing the only work that had ever actually mattered. Kian arrived Sunday afternoon with a laptop bag and a rolled printout under one arm, and he did not bother with a greeting before he had the printout spread flat across the nearest table, weighted down at each corner with whatever was within reach: a coffee mug, a stapler, Benson's spare set of keys. "I want to walk you through this slowly," Kian said, "because I need you to understand it the way a jury eventually will." He traced one finger along a line of figures running down the left side of the page. Quinton's firm has been reporting steady returns to its investors for 4 years. On paper, respectable, not spectacular. The kind of numbers that keep wealthy clients comfortable without inviting scrutiny. His finger moved to a second column, red ink, where the first had been black. Underneath that reporting, the actual portfolio has been losing money since a real estate deal collapsed almost 3 years ago. A development outside Charlotte that Quinton over-leveraged personally, expecting it to be the deal that finally stepped him out of his father's shadow. "He lost the money and kept telling investors he hadn't," I said. "He lost the money and started paying older investors their returns using new investors' principal," Kian said. "That's not a euphemism, Ezekiel. That's the actual mechanical definition of what a Ponzi structure is. It only survives as long as new capital keeps coming in faster than old capital gets paid out, and firms like his eventually run out of runway." "How long has he been running it that way?" I asked. "Best I can tell from the pattern of redemptions and new client onboarding, close to 2 years," Kian said. "Which tells you something else about the man. This wasn't a moment of panic. This was a decision he renewed every single quarter, month after month, while he sat across a dinner table from your daughter and told her everything was fine." Benson, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, let out a low whistle through his teeth. "How much runway does he have left?" I asked. Kian turned to the last page of the printout. A single spreadsheet with one number circled twice in red at the bottom. "Based on redemption requests already filed and due within the next 90 days against the liquid capital actually remaining in his accounts, he is short by just over $11 million. I have negotiated deals worth more than that number in a single afternoon without my pulse changing." This number changed it. $11 million was not a shortfall a man closed by working harder or apologizing more sincerely to his investors. It was the kind of number that ended in federal indictments in a man's name printed in a business section with the word fraud 3 words away from it. "There's more," Kian said, and something in his voice made both Benson and I go still. I cross-referenced the timeline of his cash position against the date Meghan's trust matured. $8 million became legally accessible to your daughter and granddaughter exactly 19 days before that phone call woke you up at 12:47 in the morning. The room went quiet, except for the space heater ticking against the cold. $8 million doesn't close an $11 million hole, I said slowly, doing the arithmetic even as I said it out loud. "No," Kian agreed, "but it buys him time. Enough to cover the next round of redemptions, enough to keep the SEC's attention pointed somewhere else a while longer, enough runway to either find a way out or, if he's the kind of man I suspect he is, enough runway to convince himself he still has one." I thought of Quinton standing in that hospital hallway 2 nights ago. Collar straight, not a hair out of place, calmly explaining that his wife needed to be kept somewhere quiet. I thought of the smile D'Angelo had described, the bourbon he did not drink, the 3 cold phone calls made in 20 minutes. A man does not build that kind of composure over a family disagreement. He builds it when the alternative to composure is watching everything he has ever pretended to be come apart in public. "We're not looking at a controlling husband anymore," I said. "We're looking at a man who needed my daughter declared incompetent before his own investors declared him a fraud." Kian did not disagree. He simply circled the $11 million figure a third time, hard enough that the pen nearly tore through the paper, and let the numbers sit there on the table between the 3 of us, like something none of us wanted to be the first to touch. I looked past the 2 of them out through the warehouse's one dust-streaked window at the gray afternoon settling over the parking lot outside. Somewhere across that same city, Harmony was probably home from school by now, doing homework at a kitchen table in a house that still looked from the outside like nothing had ever gone wrong inside it. Meghan was somewhere I still could not picture clearly enough to comfort me. Every number on that table was a man who had run out of ordinary ways to save himself 2 years ago, and had spent every day since then quietly deciding what he was willing to sacrifice instead. I folded my hands together on the cold table and made myself say the thing none of us had said yet out loud. "He's not going to stop on his own," I said. "A man $11 million short doesn't slow down, he speeds up." Kian did not let the $11 million figure sit for long. He turned back to his laptop, pulled up a second set of records he had cross-referenced against the security firm's contract date, and started working backward through Pisker Ridge's financial filings the way a man walks backward along a trail looking for the exact spot the tracks first appeared. "I want to check something," he said, more to himself than to either of us. If Pisker Ridge admitted Meghan that fast with a bed ready and paperwork waiting, somebody had to reserve that placement in advance. Facilities like that don't hold a bed open on a whim, especially not a private one with the kind of security wing Meghan ended up in. He found it inside 20 minutes, a wire transfer from a charitable foundation account into Pisker Ridge's admissions reserve fund. The kind of deposit facilities require to guarantee priority placement for a patient before that patient technically exists on their intake roster. "Whose foundation?" I asked, already certain of the answer and hoping in some old tired part of myself that I was wrong. "The Houston Family Foundation," Kian said. "Signing authority on the account belongs to 2 people. Quentin is one." He turned the laptop screen so both Benson and I could see it clearly. "The other signature on this specific transfer is Jocelyn's." "That doesn't prove anything on its own," Benson said, though I could hear in his voice that he did not fully believe that either. "Wealthy families move money through foundations for 100 reasons that have nothing to do with what we're looking at." "It wouldn't if the date matched anything reasonable," Kian said. He tapped the corner of the screen where a timestamp sat in small gray text. "This transfer is dated 3 weeks before Ezekiel broke down that bedroom door." The room went very still. 3 weeks. I said the number over in my head before I let myself say it out loud, because I needed to be certain I was not simply hearing what I already feared. 3 weeks was the exact date printed at the top of the power of attorney I had read in that hospital hallway, the same date that document claimed Meghan had calmly, competently signed away her own medical authority. I had already proven that date could not be genuine, that the capacity evaluation it depended on had not existed yet when the signature line was supposedly notarized. I had assumed, without ever quite saying it out loud, that the date had been chosen after the fact, backfilled onto a document built in a hurry once the real crisis began. This transfer told a different story. This transfer said the date was not backfilled at all. It was the actual date something had started. "She didn't get pulled into this after Quentin panicked," I said slowly, the words arranging themselves in my mouth before I had fully finished the thought. "She reserved a bed for my daughter 3 weeks before anything happened, to justify one." Kian nodded, once grim. Whatever this was going to be, Jocelyn wasn't reacting to a crisis. She was scheduling one. He said it quietly, but there was something underneath his usual flat delivery, a kind of professional disgust I had not heard from him before, not even when he had described the mechanics of the Ponzi scheme itself. Kian had spent his career chasing men who stole money, This was the first time in that room he had said out loud what it looked like when someone planned to steal a person. I thought of every family dinner I had sat through at that estate over 3 years, watching Jocelyn correct a caterer's math, or quietly review a charity gala seating chart with the focus of a woman who trusted nothing she had not verified herself. I had read that habit wrongly, as simple control, the harmless vanity of a woman who liked things done her way. I understood now that I had been looking at the wrong kind of control the entire time. A woman who insists on reading every line herself does not do it because she distrusts other people's competence. She does it because she cannot afford for anyone else to see what those lines actually say. I thought, too, of the way she had stood in her own doorway at 1 a.m, dressed, composed, lipstick fresh, and I understood now that I had misjudged even that. I had told myself she was simply a woman who did not sleep easily. She had not been waiting up out of habit. She had been waiting for a call she already knew was coming, on a night she had reserved a room for 3 weeks before it arrived. I need to know exactly what she told Meghan that night, I said. Not what Quentin told me in that hallway. What Jocelyn actually said to my daughter before any of us knew there was a plan to interrupt. That's Novaly's territory now, Benson said. I talked to her again yesterday. She's willing to help, but she's spooked, and a text exchange isn't going to get us the kind of detail we actually need. We need to sit across from her somewhere quiet, somewhere she doesn't feel like she's on the clock. I had not forgotten Novaly's message from 2 days earlier, only set it aside while the financial picture came into focus, and hearing her name again reminded me that we now had 2 separate threads pulling toward the same building. A woman risking her job to tell us the truth from inside Pisgah Ridge, and a paper trail proving Jocelyn had reserved a bed there 3 weeks before she had any legitimate reason to need one. Set it up, I said. Wherever, whenever she's comfortable. I'll be there. D'Angelo Trevino was already waiting when I pulled into the empty end of the grocery store parking lot, sitting in a gray sedan with the engine running and both hands visible on the wheel, the posture of a man who wanted whoever approached him to see immediately that he was not a threat. I got in on the passenger side. He did not look at me right away. I've thought about calling you a dozen times since your accountant reached out, he said, eyes fixed straight ahead through the windshield at the shuttered loading dock across the lot. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business, that I just do the numbers, I don't make the decisions. His hands tightened on the wheel. I stopped believing that about a week ago. What changed? Quentin asked me to move client redemption requests into a queue system that delays payout by 90 days, dressed up as a processing enhancement. He said the phrase with visible disgust, like it left a taste in his mouth. I've built enough of these systems to know what a stall tactic looks like when I'm the one being asked to build it. He's not managing a temporary shortfall, Mr. Gates. He's buying time he doesn't actually have a plan to use. He reached into the door pocket and handed me a thick manila envelope sealed heavier than I expected. Internal memos, wire authorization records, a spreadsheet I built myself tracking the real portfolio losses against what's been reported to the board. His voice caught on the next part. If I hand this to you, I need to know I'm protected. I have a daughter starting college next year. I can't do that from a federal cell. I looked at him properly for the first time since getting into that car, and I saw underneath the expensive coat and the careful haircut a man who had spent 2 years lying awake doing exactly the kind of arithmetic I had watched Keon do on a whiteboard an hour earlier. Except D'Angelo had been doing it alone, in the dark, with no one to tell him the number out loud. I can't promise you immunity, I said honestly, because I have never once told a frightened man something comforting that I could not back up with paper. But I can promise you this. Cooperation early, before an indictment, looks very different to a prosecutor than cooperation forced out of someone after the fact. Every day you wait makes that harder to argue, not easier. He sat with that a long moment, then took a single folded page from his jacket, a handwritten statement he had clearly drafted and redrafted more than once, and signed it in front of me with a pen that shook visibly enough that his signature came out smaller than the printed name above it. Tell your accountant, he said, that queue system launches Monday. Whatever you're planning, it needs to move faster than that. I thanked him and got out into the cold, envelope pressed flat against my ribs beneath my coat, and drove straight from that parking lot to a gravel turnout behind a closed Baptist church on the edge of town, where Benson had arranged through channels I still did not fully understand for Novalee to meet us on her dinner break. She was younger than I expected, barely into her 30s, sitting in her own car with the dome light off and a takeout coffee cup wedged between her knees. She rolled the window down 2 inches when I approached, no further. "I can't be seen doing this," she said. "I need you to understand that before I say anything else." "I understand. Your daughter is heavily sedated. More than the chart says she should be if you ask me, though nobody's asking me." She glanced once at her rearview mirror before continuing. "She has moments of clarity in the mornings before the second dose. She's scared, Mr. Gates. She keeps asking for you by name, and they keep writing it down like it's a symptom instead of a fact." Something in my chest folded in on itself at that quiet and total, the kind of pain that does not make a sound. I did not tell Novalee what that particular detail cost me to hear. I only nodded once, the way I have nodded through 100 depositions, when a witness said something I needed to absorb without letting my face show the absorbing. "Is there anything else?" I asked, when I trusted my voice again. Novalee hesitated, glanced at her phone, then back at me. "There's a visit scheduled for tomorrow night, Mrs. Houston." She said the name carefully, like she was weighing whether to say the rest. "I've worked there 2 years, Mr. Gates. Family members visit constantly, all hours, no restrictions for a woman with her kind of money on the board. But Jocelyn Houston has never once come to see a patient herself. Not one time. She sends flowers, she sends checks. She does not come." My phone buzzed against my leg less than an hour later, after I had already dropped Benson at his truck, a single text from the unfamiliar number I had already saved under her name. "Confirmed for 8 tomorrow night. She's never done this before. I don't know what it means, but I don't like it." I sat in my own driveway for a long while after reading it, engine-off envelope from D'Angelo still pressed against my ribs, and let the 2 pieces of that night settle against each other. A confession recorded on paper by a frightened accountant and a warning texted by a frightened nurse. Both of them telling me the same thing from 2 completely different directions. Whatever Jocelyn Houston was planning for 8 o'clock tomorrow night, it was not a mother's visit. Women who send flowers instead of showing up in person do not suddenly change that habit for a reason anyone would call comforting. Novalee met us behind the maintenance shed on the north side of the property at 7 that evening, a full hour before Jocelyn's visit was scheduled, and handed Benson a small black audio transmitter no larger than a shirt button, along with a folded diagram of the residential wing. "I already placed the receiver end in the lamp beside her bed this morning," she said, voice low, even out here, well away from any window. "Battery's good for 6 hours. It broadcasts on a short-range frequency to whatever's listening within about a quarter mile. I can't promise you clean audio through concrete walls, but it should carry enough." "How did you get it approved past intake security?" I asked. "I didn't ask anyone to approve it," Novalee said, and did not elaborate further, which told me everything I needed to know about the risk she was taking and how little she wanted either of us to thank her for it out loud. She glanced at her watch, then back toward the lit windows of the main building. "I have to get back before someone notices I'm not on the floor. Whatever you hear tonight, please don't do anything that gets traced back to a nurse who happened to be working this shift." She did not wait for an answer. She was already walking fast, hugging the tree line gone before either of us could tell her she had already done more than we had any right to ask. Pisgah Ridge sits back from the road behind a stand of white pine, close enough to town that the parking lot lights bleed faintly against the low clouds, far enough that no casual passerby would ever wonder what happens inside it. Quinton's medical proxy meant the front desk would turn me away the moment I gave my name, restraining order or not, so there was never any question of walking through that door myself. Benson parked his truck on the shoulder of the access road, engine off, close enough to catch the transmitter signal far enough that we were simply 2 men sitting in a parked vehicle at dusk, nothing a passing security patrol would think twice about. He handed me one earpiece and kept the other for himself. We sat in that cab for the better part of an hour, with almost nothing said between us. Benson worked his gum in slow, even rotations, eyes fixed on the dark tree line rather than on me. The particular courtesy of a man who understands that some silences are not his to fill. Once, somewhere around 7:30, he offered me half a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm, and I took it more for something to hold than any real want of it. My hands needed an occupation. They had needed one for 6 days now, ever since a phone had rung at 12:47 in the morning and never stopped ringing in one form or another since. "You don't have to sit through this with me," I said mostly to break the silence. "You've already given more time to this than I had any right to ask." Benson did not look away from the tree line. "I retired from the department the year my own daughter stopped speaking to me over something a lot smaller than any of this," he said flat, no self-pity in it at all. "I don't get many chances anymore to sit in a truck and actually do something about a father losing his kid. I'll stay as long as you're staying, Ezekiel." I did not have an answer for that, and he did not seem to want one. We went back to watching the tree line. Static at first, the particular hollow static of an empty room being broadcast to nobody. A heating vent cycling somewhere in the background, once the distant squeak of a gurney wheel passing in a hallway. I sat with that sound in my ear and thought about how many nights Meghan had spent inside that room listening to those exact same small mechanical noises with no one on the other end of anything to hear her. At 8:08, a door opened on the recording. Footsteps unhurried, the particular click of heels that does not belong to a nurse's shift shoes. A pause long enough that I pictured Jocelyn standing in the doorway the same way she had stood in her own doorway that first terrible night, taking the measure of a room before deciding how to enter it. "Meghan." Jocelyn's voice came through my earpiece, thin and slightly distorted, but unmistakably hers, warm on the surface, in exactly the register I remembered from 3 years of family dinners. "It's just me, dear. I wanted to see you properly, alone." I felt Benson go still beside me in the dark of that truck cab, both of us leaning forward without meaning to, as if leaning closer to a speaker could somehow close the actual quarter-mile of distance between us and that room. Neither of us said a word. There was nothing left to do now but listen. I have spent a career in rooms where the outcome of a case turned on a single sentence buried inside a much longer conversation, and I have learned over 31 years exactly how much discipline it takes to sit still through the parts that do not matter, waiting for the part that does. This was harder than any of that. In a courtroom, whatever I was listening for belonged to strangers. Tonight, whatever came through that thin, wavering signal belonged to a room where my own daughter lay half-conscious under a stranger's lamp, and there was no version of professional distance wide enough to make that easier to hold. Benson reached over without looking at me and turned the truck's dome light off entirely, so that the only illumination left in that cab was the faint green glow of the receiver's signal indicator, and the two of us sat in that near-total dark, listening to a hallway a quarter-mile away, waiting to hear what a mother says to a daughter-in-law she believes cannot understand a word of it. A chair scraped once, close to the microphone, the sound of someone settling in for a conversation they intended to take their time with. "You look better than they told me you would," Jocelyn said. Her voice had lost the careful warmth from the doorway, settling into something quieter, almost confessional, the register of a woman speaking to someone she does not entirely believe can hear her. "I know this isn't what any of us wanted, Meghan. I want you to understand that whatever you remember once the fog clears, none of this was ever about you." A long pause. When she spoke again, her voice had drifted somewhere further away, as if she had turned from the bed toward the window. "Quentin has always tried so hard to be the man his father was, harder than anyone gives him credit for. His father built that firm out of nothing, nothing at all. And Quentin has spent his whole life terrified of being the generation that loses it." Something that might have been a small, humorless laugh. I told myself for 2 years it was a rough patch, a market correction. I told myself that right up until the morning he sat across from me at my own kitchen table and admitted how deep it actually went. And by then, there wasn't a version of fixing it quietly that didn't run straight through you,
and that trust your mother built.
I felt my own pulse in the earpiece, or perhaps that was only the transmitter's static. I could no longer entirely tell the two apart. Dr. LeBlanc has been a family friend for 20 years, Jocelyn continued, and there was something almost administrative in her tone now. A woman walking through a checklist. He understood the way old friends understand things without needing every detail spelled out for them. The guardianship only needed to cover both of you, you understand? You and that little girl, together, or none of the arrangements would have held up the way they needed to. I know how that sounds,
Said plainly like that. I am not proud of how plainly it sounds.
I am not a cruel woman, whatever you decide to believe about me later, Jocelyn went on. I made arrangements before things could get out of hand, a place for you to rest, a doctor who understood discretion. I told myself all of it, every piece of it, was simply helping my son through a difficult season, temporarily, just until he found his footing again, and none of this ever had to become permanent for you. Just until. Temporarily. I sat in the dark of that truck cab and heard, underneath the practiced gentleness of her voice, a woman rehearsing a version of events for an audience she had already decided did not exist, testing out the sentence she intended to believe about herself for the rest of her life. Your father is a stubborn man, she said, and something sharper moved under the words now. He was supposed to grieve quietly and go home. Instead, he keeps digging in places that were never meant to be dug in. I don't know what he thinks he's going to find. I only know that whatever it is, it will not change what's already been decided for you. And it will certainly not change what happens to that little girl if he keeps making this harder than it needs to be. She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened back into something almost maternal, almost convinced of itself. I keep telling myself this is temporary, that once the trust clears and Quentin's firm is steady again, we simply undo it all quietly, and you come home. And none of this ever needs to be spoken of at a holiday table. I have to believe that, Meghan. I don't know how to keep doing what I'm doing tonight without believing it.
There was a small sound on the recording, then faint, almost lost under the hum of the heating vent. A single word, slurred, barely shaped. Dad? Jocelyn went quiet for a long moment.
Not tonight, dear, she finally said gently, the way you might correct a child who has asked for something impossible. He can't help you tonight.
The chair scraped again. Footsteps retreating the door, clicking shut, and then nothing but the empty static of that room broadcasting itself back to us across a quarter-mile of dark pine trees. Benson reached over and clicked the receiver off. Neither of us said anything for a long time.
That's enough for a jury, Benson finally said, quiet, almost reverent the way a man speaks in a room where something serious has just finished happening. Every element. Premeditation, the guardianship motive, the money, LeBlanc's name on the record. That's not a father's suspicion anymore, Ezekiel. That's a case. I heard him. I understood in the part of my mind that still functioned the way it had functioned for 31 years, exactly what we now held and exactly what it would do to the people in that recording. None of that understanding reached the rest of me yet.
I sat with both hands flat on my knees, palms down, and did not move.
Somewhere out past the windshield, an owl called twice from the tree line and went silent. The truck's heater ticked as it cooled. I reached into my coat pocket without deciding to and found Renata's glasses exactly where I always keep them, and I held them there in my closed fist without putting them on. Without needing to read anything else tonight. Only needing something of hers in my hand, while I sat with what I had just heard my daughter's mother-in-law say to a room she believed was empty of anyone who mattered. I did not sleep that night either, though this time it was not fear keeping me upright at the kitchen table. It was arithmetic. I had spent 31 years learning that evidence, however damning, is only as useful as the timeline you deploy it inside. And by 4 in the morning, I had worked out exactly how little time that timeline actually gave us. Quentin's delayed redemption system launched in less than 24 hours. Once it did, every investor waiting on a payout would start asking questions publicly instead of privately. And a cornered man with $11 million of other people's money already gone does not become more careful under that kind of pressure. He becomes faster and less predictable. And faster and less predictable was not a version of Quentin Houston I wanted anywhere near my daughter or my granddaughter. There was a second clock running alongside that one, quieter, but just as urgent. Marcus Webb had already filed for an expedited emergency guardianship hearing to formalize what the temporary orders had only begun, and my own family law colleague had warned me the court could set that hearing on as little as 5 days' notice. 2 clocks ticking toward 2 different rooms, and I needed both of them to land in the same place at the same hour, or the whole plan came apart in the gap between them. I called Keon first, and he confirmed what I already suspected. The forensic package was close to complete, clean enough to hand to a prosecutor without embarrassing anyone who touched it. But a case this size needed federal reach to freeze assets before Quentin could move them. And neither Keon nor Benson had the standing to make that call alone.
"I know someone," Benson said when I reached him next.
"Retired detective friend of mine liaises with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit now. Special agent named Knox Mejia. He's sharp, he's territorial about his cases, and he does not waste time on anything that isn't real. I can get you a number, but Ezekiel, once you make this call, there's no taking it back. You're handing a sitting federal agent probable cause on a member of your own family." He stopped being family the moment he decided my daughter's mind was worth less than his father's reputation, I said, and Benson did not argue with that. Fielding, my own attorney friend, who had reviewed Webb's original petition, called back within the hour to confirm the guardianship hearing had in fact been set faster than usual given the urgency Webb's filing had claimed, for the following Thursday morning at 9 o'clock in Judge Priscilla Warfield's family courtroom downtown. 4 days. I wrote the date on the same legal pad where I had written Pisgah Ridge, the security contract, and every other thread of this that had finally begun pulling itself into a single rope. I dialed the number that evening from the warehouse on speaker, with Keon's laptop open beside me, showing the summary page of everything we had built. The voice that answered was flat and unhurried, the particular calm of a man who has learned that excitement in his line of work usually gets someone killed or gets a case thrown out. "Mejia, my name is Ezekiel Gates. Benson Orozco gave me your number. I have documentation of an ongoing securities fraud scheme close to $12 million, currently being used as leverage to fraudulently seize legal guardianship over my daughter and granddaughter." There was a pause on the line, brief, but I have negotiated enough deals to recognize the particular silence of someone recalculating how important a phone call has just become. "Walk me through what you've got," Mejia said, and something underneath the flat professional tone had sharpened the same quiet hunger I imagine a man carries when he has spent months circling a case that keeps sliding just out of reach. I gave him the shape of it without handing him everything the Q system launching to stall redemptions, the $11 million shortfall Keon had documented the trust fund maturing 19 days before my daughter was drugged in her own home. I did not mention the recording yet. Some cards, even with federal agents, are better shown after the terms of the table are agreed on, rather than before. "I can have a warrant application moving within hours once I see documentation," Mejia said. "But I need to be straight with you, Mr. Gates. If there's a parallel family court proceeding, a guardianship hearing, anything like that on the calendar, my office moves on our own timeline, not yours. We don't coordinate around a custody case." "There's a hearing," I said. "I intend for you to be standing in that courtroom when it happens." Another pause, shorter this time. "That's not exactly standard procedure. Neither is a mother-in-law scheduling a psychiatric admission 3 weeks before the crisis that supposedly caused it," I said. "I'm not asking you to bend a rule for my convenience, Agent Mejia. I'm telling you that the fastest path to your arrest and the fastest path to my daughter's freedom happened to run through the exact same room at the exact same hour, and I'd like us both to be standing in it." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Keon looked up from his laptop. "Send the documentation tonight," Mejia finally said. "Everything. If it holds up the way you're describing it, I'll be there." A pause, and then, almost as an afterthought, in a voice that had lost some of its official flatness. For what it's worth, Mr. Gates, I've had my eye on Houston Capitol's filings for about 4 months now. Couldn't get a thread to pull. You just handed me the whole spool. I ended the call and looked across the table at Keon, who was already typing, and at Benson, who had gone very still by the door, the way he did whenever a case shifted in his estimation from difficult to real. "He'll come," I said. "Now we need to make sure there's still a hearing worth him coming to." We worked through Wednesday night at the warehouse the way I imagine a surgical team works through the hours before a procedure nobody is allowed to postpone. Keon finalizing exhibit numbers on the financial package, Benson coordinating logistics with Mejia's office over a laptop propped against a stack of case boxes, all three of us running on coffee gone bitter from sitting too long on the burner. My phone buzzed just after 11. I did not recognize dread the instant I saw Novali's name on the screen, not the way I recognized it later. I simply reached for the phone the way I had reached for every message from her since that first text outside Harmoni's school, already half expecting routine. Her mother's blood sugar spiked. Bumped up Meghan's evening dose without a new order on file. Second time this week they've done that without documentation. I don't like it, Mr. Gates. I don't like the timing of it at all. I read it twice before the meaning of it fully landed, and when it did, I sat down hard in the folding chair behind me, my legs simply choosing to stop holding me upright for a moment. The warehouse's space heater ticked somewhere behind me. Keon's keyboard had gone quiet. I do not know how long I sat there before I trusted myself to look up again, only that when I did, both of them were watching me, waiting. An unlogged increase, 2 nights running, 4 days before a hearing that would either strip Quentin and Jocelyn of every advantage they had built or hand them my daughter's mind and my granddaughter's future outright. I have spent a career reading the difference between careless paperwork and paperwork someone deliberately chose not to create, and this was not carelessness. This was a family clearing the floor before a fire they already knew was coming, making certain that whatever state Meghan was in by Thursday morning would be too compromised to contradict whatever Quentin's attorney intended to say about her on the stand. "They're not just holding her," I said once I trusted my voice enough to say it out loud to the room. "They're making sure she can't testify to anything by the time we get to court." Keon looked up sharply from his laptop. Benson was already reaching for his own phone. "I want a welfare check filed tonight," I said. "Emergency wellness visit, independent physician, court order if we have to get one signed by an emergency judge, but somebody outside that facility's own staff needs eyes on my daughter before Thursday morning, and it needs to happen now, not after a hearing that may already be too late to matter to her." Fielding, when I reached her at home, well past what any reasonable hour allows for a phone call, did not hesitate. "I can have an emergency motion in front of Judge Alvarez by 7 tomorrow morning," she said. "It won't be pretty filing a welfare check request 4 days before a guardianship hearing on the same patient, but the unlogged medication changes give us exactly the kind of documented urgency a judge can't easily wave off. I'll need everything Novali has given you dated exact, and I'll need it in the next 20 minutes if we're going to make the morning docket." "You'll have it in 10, I told her, and meant it. "Ezekiel." Her voice softened slightly just for a moment the way it does when she is speaking to me as an old friend rather than a client. "This is the right move. I want you to hear that from someone besides yourself at 1 in the morning. You're not overreacting. You're doing exactly what a good lawyer would tell any other father to do." I sent her everything within the hour, hands steadier now that they had something concrete to do again. It was well past midnight by the time the warehouse finally went quiet. Keon asleep, sitting upright in his chair, with his glasses still on. Benson stretched out across 2 folding chairs pushed together, snoring softly into the collar of his jacket. I did not sleep. I drove home instead, let myself into the dark house and stood for a long while in front of the closet where I still keep the navy suit I used to wear for the largest contract negotiations of my career, the one I had not put on since before Renata's funeral. I took it out and hung it on the back of the bathroom door and stood in front of the mirror in my shirt sleeves, studying the man looking back at me. Older than the last time this suit had seen daylight, thinner through the shoulders than I remembered being. The frightened father who had broken down a door 9 days ago was gone from that reflection entirely. What stood there instead was a man preparing the same way he had prepared for every negotiation that had ever mattered, for the last and only hearing that would decide whether he got his family back. I thought buttoning the jacket slowly of Harmony's small hand shooting into the air across a street I was not permitted to cross, and of Meghan's voice slurred and shrinking on the other end of a phone call that had started all of this 9 days ago, and I understood standing there at 1 in the morning in a suit I had not worn since I buried my wife, that I was no longer simply trying to win an argument. I was trying to bring both of them home whole, and a man does not dress like this for anything less than that. I put the suit on anyway that night alone in an empty house at 1 in the morning. Not because I needed to wear it yet, but because I needed for just a few minutes to remember exactly who I still was underneath everything the last 9 days had tried to strip away from me. The heavy oak doors of the Buncombe County Family Courthouse closed behind me at 8:57 that Thursday morning, sealing off the noise of the hallway, and I felt the particular pressurized quiet that settles over a courtroom in the minutes before a judge takes the bench. A silence built entirely out of people trying very hard not to look as nervous as they feel. Judge Guillermo Parks presided from the bench, a heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed low on his nose, and the unhurried manner of someone who had sat through enough manufactured family crises to no longer be easily impressed by one. Fielding sat beside me at the respondent's table, her briefcase already open, papers organized into color-coded tabs with the precision of a woman who had not slept more than 3 hours in the last 2 nights, either. At the petitioner's table, Quentin sat in a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things always fit him effortlessly. And beside him, Marcus Webb arranged a thick binder with the confident economy of motion of a man who has never once lost a hearing he considered routine. Jocelyn sat directly behind them in the gallery composed, dressed in muted gray, a woman who had clearly decided that today called for quiet dignity rather than performance. I did not see Novalee anywhere, which was exactly as it should be. Whatever she had risked for us, none of it could ever be traced back to a courtroom. We're here this morning on the matter of emergency guardianship for Meghan Houston and the minor child Harmony Houston, Judge Parks said without preamble, the tone of a man who intended to move through his docket efficiently, regardless of how much money sat at either table. Mr. Webb, your petition is up first. Webb rose smoothly and walked the court through 11 days of carefully assembled narrative, the same architecture Quentin and LeBlanc had built in that hospital hallway the first night, only polished now, footnoted, supported by exhibits with tabs and page numbers. A wife in psychiatric crisis. A husband managing her care with discretion and devotion. A grandfather whose erratic door-breaking behavior had necessitated a protective order for the sake of a traumatized 7-year-old. Mr. Houston has acted throughout this ordeal with remarkable restraint and care, Webb said, closing his binder with a soft, satisfied sound. We are asking this court simply to formalize what has already been functioning out of necessity for the past 11 days. Quentin, when called, delivered his own account with the smooth, rehearsed sorrow I remembered from that first hospital hallway, describing sleepless nights at his wife's bedside, the agony of watching a marriage he had fought to protect dissolve into something he no longer recognized, the unbearable necessity of protecting a 7-year-old from a grandfather's escalating instability. He did not once raise his voice. He did not once look toward me at the respondent's table, which struck me, watching him, as its own kind of tell. A truly wronged husband glances at his accuser at least once. Quentin kept his eyes fixed on the judge the entire time. The practiced discipline of a man reciting lines he had rehearsed enough times to know exactly where the emotion needed to land. I watched Judge Parks's face for any sign of skepticism and found remarkably little. Webb had built this well. It was on its surface exactly the kind of clean, sympathetic story a tired family court judge sees 100 versions of every year and has learned out of sheer volume to simply accept. I felt the weight of the welfare check report sitting in Fielding's briefcase like a held breath. It had come back at 6 that morning, rushed through an emergency physician Fielding had arranged, confirming what Novelli's texts had already told us. An unlogged sedation increase inconsistent with any documented medical order, and a patient too heavily medicated to meaningfully participate in her own hearing. It was damning. It was also on its own only half the story. A wound, without yet showing the hand that had made it. Fielding had counseled patients through every hour of the drive downtown that morning. Judges do not like being told in the first 5 minutes of a hearing that the polished narrative in front of them is a fabrication. They like being shown slowly, precisely, in an order that makes the conclusion feel like their own discovery, rather than an accusation. I understood the strategy. I had used versions of it myself for 31 years. Understanding it did not make it any easier to sit still while Judge Parks reached for a pen that would, if it touched that page, hand my daughter and granddaughter to the two people in that room who least deserved them. Given the documentation before me, Judge Parks said, drawing the guardianship order toward himself across the bench, and absent any credible challenge to the petitioner's account this morning, I am inclined to grant emergency guardianship as requested. He reached for his pen. I felt Fielding's hand tighten briefly around my forearm under the table. A signal, a warning, a question all at once. Quentin allowed himself for just a fraction of a second the smallest and most satisfied smile I had seen on his face since that first terrible night. The smile of a man who believed, correctly, that he was 3 seconds from winning everything. Your Honor, before you sign that order, the respondent has evidence directly relevant to the fitness of the petitioner that this court has not yet had the opportunity to hear. Fielding was on her feet before I had fully processed that I had already nodded at her to begin. Judge Parks's pen stopped a half-inch above the page, and I watched something shift behind his reading glasses. Not yet alarm, only the particular attentiveness of a man who does not like surprises in his courtroom, and intends to find out immediately whether this one is worth his patience. "This is highly irregular," Webb said, rising halfway out of his chair. "Your Honor, we've presented a complete and thoroughly documented petition." "Sit down, Counselor. I'll decide what's irregular in my own courtroom." Judge Parks set the pen down slower than he had picked it up. "Ms. Fielding, you have 5 minutes to convince me this isn't a delay tactic." I stood, because some things a man needs to say in his own voice, regardless of who is licensed to argue on his behalf. 9 days ago I had stood in a hospital hallway and let a stranger in a white coat tell me who had standing to make decisions about my own family. I did not intend to sit quietly through a second version of that morning. "Your Honor, my name is Ezekiel Gates. I spent 31 years practicing commercial law in this state before my retirement, and I want the court to understand that everything I am about to present has been independently verified and can withstand any scrutiny opposing counsel wishes to apply to it." I nodded to Fielding, who crossed to the clerk's desk and began entering exhibits with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. First, a forensic financial analysis showing that Quentin Houston's investment firm is currently insolvent by approximately $11 million, a shortfall he has concealed from investors and regulators for nearly 2 years. Quentin's composure did not break, not yet, but his hand found the edge of the table and stayed there. Second, a signed statement from the firm's own chief financial officer corroborating that shortfall and describing an active scheme to delay investor redemptions while Mr. Houston sought alternative sources of capital. Fielding slid the signed page across to the clerk. Third, records showing that Meghan Houston's trust fund, jointly benefiting her and her daughter, matured exactly 19 days before the night I found my daughter drugged in her own bedroom. A low murmur moved through the gallery. Judge Parks held up one hand for silence without looking up from the documents Fielding was placing in front of him. Beside me, I felt, rather than saw, Fielding glance at her watch, aware as I was that a courtroom's attention is a finite resource, and we had already spent a good portion of it. Fourth, my voice did not shake, though I felt something in my chest doing exactly that. An independent medical evaluation completed this morning under court-appropriate emergency protocol documenting an unlogged sedation increase administered to Meghan Houston twice in the last week, with no corresponding physician's order on file.
Webb was on his feet again.
Your Honor, none of this establishes anything beyond a financial dispute that has nothing to do with—
I'm not finished, Mr. Webb.
I turned back to the bench. Your Honor, I have one final piece of evidence, and I would ask the court's indulgence to play it directly because I do not believe any summary I could offer would do it justice. Judge Parks studied me for a long moment. Then Quentin, whose face had gone the particular gray of a man watching a structure he built collapse floor by floor in front of him. I have stood in front of judges my entire professional life and learned to read the particular silence that comes before a ruling, the small tells, a shift of weight, a glance toward the clock, a finger tapping once against the bench. Judge Parks gave me none of those tells. He simply sat with the question a moment longer than I expected, weighing, I imagine, 30 years of instinct about which requests in his courtroom were genuine and which were theater, before he finally spoke. "Play it," the judge said. Fielding connected the small recorder to the courtroom's audio system, and the room filled with the sound of a chair scraping and then Jocelyn's own voice, warm and confessional, rolling out over a courtroom gone entirely silent. I did not look at Jocelyn while it played. I looked at Judge Parks instead and watched, sentence by sentence, the exact moment a tired family court judge stopped seeing a routine petition and started seeing a crime. Quentin's hand had left the table entirely now, both arms pulled in tight against his sides, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, the way a man looks when he is trying very hard to be somewhere else. Webb had stopped writing on his legal pad 3 sentences into the recording and simply set his pen down. The particular stillness of a lawyer who has just heard his own case die in real time. When the recording reached the words "guardianship only needed to cover both of you," I heard somewhere behind me in the gallery the unmistakable sound of a woman's composure finally breaking apart. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes on the bench where Judge Parks had gone, very still, one hand resting flat against the guardianship order he had been half a signature away from granting, and I understood, watching him, that whatever happened in the next several minutes, that particular pen was never going to touch that particular page. Judge Parks removed his reading glasses entirely, set them on the bench beside the unsigned order, and looked out over the courtroom with an expression I imagine very few attorneys in this county have ever wanted directed at their own client. "In 30 years on this bench," he said, "I have rarely seen a petition arrive this thoroughly dressed and this completely hollow underneath. The emergency guardianship order is denied in full." He drew a fresh sheet from the folder at his left hand. "Furthermore, the temporary restraining order previously entered against Mr. Gates is vacated, effective immediately, and I am entering an emergency order granting Ezekiel Gates full temporary guardianship of both Meghan Houston and the minor child Harmony Houston, pending a complete hearing on permanent arrangements." The gavel came down, once sharp, final. Fielding's hand found my forearm, again gripping this time, instead of merely resting, and I understood distantly that I had been holding my breath since somewhere around the 3rd exhibit and had not yet remembered to let it out. The courtroom doors at the back swung open before the sound had finished echoing off the walls. Special Agent Knox Mejia came through them first, 2 agents in dark suits behind him, moving with the unhurried, absolute authority of men who had been waiting in a hallway for exactly this cue. "Quentin Houston." Mejia's voice carried the length of the room without needing to be raised. "You're under arrest for securities fraud and wire fraud in connection with the operations of Houston Capital Investments." Quentin did not resist. He stood when the agents reached him, arms already lifting the particular boneless compliance of a man who has run out of moves and finally understands it. As they turned him toward the aisle, his eyes found mine for the first time since Fielding had entered the recording into evidence, and whatever he was searching for in my face, I did not give it to him. I simply watched him go. Jocelyn had not moved from the gallery. When the courtroom's noise finally settled enough for a single voice to carry, hers was the one that did, small and stripped of every ounce of the polish I had watched her wear like armor for 3 years. Where did I go wrong, Ezekiel? I do not think she expected an answer. I do not think, watching her face in that moment, that she was entirely asking me at all. I thought of 11 days of contracts and dates and wire transfers of a woman who had planned a crisis 3 weeks before it happened, and then spent every day since convincing herself the word temporary made any of it forgivable. I had every right standing there to answer her question honestly and without mercy. I found in that moment that I did not want to. Whatever Jocelyn Houston had done, and however deliberately she had done it, I understood suddenly that becoming the kind of man who delivers a verdict of his own in a courthouse hallway was not a version of winning I had any interest in claiming. I stood there a moment longer, Fielding's hand light on my elbow, and I let the silence sit, rather than fill it with something I would have regretted saying in a room this full. There would be a reckoning for Jocelyn Houston, a different one than her son's, built from a different shape of guilt, and none of it was mine to hand her in a hallway full of strangers. I turned instead and walked out through the same heavy oak doors I had come in through less than an hour earlier, Fielding beside me, Kean and Benson rising from the gallery to fall into step, and none of us said very much as we crossed the marble lobby and out into a gray Thursday morning that looked, for the first time in 11 days, like it might actually hold something worth reaching for. Benson clapped one hand once against my shoulder on the courthouse steps, wordless, and Kean shook my hand with both of his, the way a man shakes hands when a handshake is not nearly a large enough gesture for what actually needs saying. I thanked them both. I do not remember honestly exactly what I said. I only remember wanting more than I wanted anything else in that moment, to be alone, long enough to feel whatever it was I had been holding at bay since 12:47 in the morning, 11 days ago. I did not fully understand how much the morning had cost me until I was alone in my truck in the courthouse parking deck, engine off, both hands resting on the wheel. They would not stop shaking. I sat with that for a long while, the particular useless anger of a body finally allowed to feel what it had been holding at bay for 11 straight days. And I did not try to make it stop. I only sat watching my own hands tremble against a steering wheel I was not yet ready to turn, thinking of Harmony's small hand shooting into the air across a street I could finally cross again, thinking of Meghan's slurred single word cutting through a recording I would carry the sound of for the rest of my life. I had won every piece of what I set out to win in that courtroom. Sitting alone in that parking deck, I did not feel like a man who had won anything at all. I felt only like a man whose hands, for the first time in 11 days, had finally been given permission to stop being steady. 6 weeks is not very long in the scheme of a life, but it was long enough for the dogwood outside my kitchen window to come into bloom, and long enough for the worst of what happened last winter to settle from a raw wound into something closer to a scar. The kind you stop noticing until your hand brushes over it by accident. Quinton pled guilty in April to wire fraud and securities fraud rather than face trial on charges that could have kept him in federal prison for the rest of his working life. His attorney negotiated the plea to 11 years. Jocelyn's case moves more slowly. The district attorney charged her with conspiracy and unlawful restraint, and Fielding believes she is looking at 5 to 8 years if it goes to trial. Longer, if prosecutors can tie the foundation transfer as tightly to premeditation as I believe it does. She lost her seat on every board she ever sat on within a week of the arrest. Her house is for sale. I have not asked, and no one has offered, what she plans to do with whatever is left once the lawyers and restitution orders finish with what used to be the Houston fortune. Meghan is healing, which is not the same thing as healed. Some mornings, she is entirely herself, sharp and funny, correcting a student's fingering on a borrowed keyboard at my kitchen table, the way she has corrected wrong notes her whole life. Other mornings, the fog from those weeks at Pisgah Ridge settles back over her without warning, and she goes quiet in a way I have learned not to fill with questions. Her doctor tells us both this will take longer than either of us wants it to take. I have stopped arguing with that particular piece of professional advice. I spent 31 years believing that the right amount of preparation could shorten almost anything. I no longer believe that, not entirely, and I have decided I am at peace with what that costs me to admit. D'Angelo's cooperation, as I promised him it would, carried real weight with the prosecutor's office. He entered a plea to a single reduced charge and avoided prison entirely. A probationary sentence and a permanent bar from the securities industry, which he tells Keon he considers the easiest trade of his professional life. Novalee, I have not been able to thank properly, not in any way that would not put her career at further risk, so I do what I can instead. Every few weeks, an anonymous donation finds its way to the continuing education fund at the hospital where she trained, large enough, I hope that she will eventually wonder about the source, and wondering, understand. This afternoon, the light came in low and gold across the back porch, the particular slant of early spring that makes even an ordinary Tuesday look like it has been staged for something. Harmony was in the yard chasing the neighbor's cat with the single-minded seriousness only a 7-year-old can bring to a task that matters to absolutely no one else. And I sat on the porch steps with a mug of coffee going cold in my hands, watching her the way I have watched her since she first learned to walk across this same yard. She gave up on the cat eventually and flopped down beside me out of breath, cheeks pink with the exertion of a chase she never had any real chance of winning. Grandpa, can I see the glasses again? I still keep Renata's reading glasses in my coat pocket out of habit now, as much as anything else, and I drew them out and set them carefully on Harmony's nose, where they sat comically large, sliding immediately down toward the tip. Your grandmother wore these. I told her the way I have told her a dozen times since the trial ended. When she wanted to read something all the way to the truth of it. What's the truth of it? Harmony asked, squinting up at me through lenses built for a face 40 years older than hers. I did not answer the way I might have answered a year ago, with a lawyer's precision, a definition, a careful clause. I only reached over and straightened the glasses on her small nose and let her wear them a while longer in the fading gold light, and understood, watching her, that some truths are not meant to be explained to a 7-year-old at all. Some truths are only meant to be sat beside quietly for as long as it takes, until the person you love simply knows, without needing the words for it, that you are staying right here beside them either way. I have spent most of my life believing that if I read a thing carefully enough, quickly enough, thoroughly enough, I could stand between the people I love and whatever was coming for them. I built a career on that belief. And after Renata died, I built, without ever quite admitting it to myself, a kind of armor out of it, reading every document twice, trusting nothing I had not verified with my own eyes, mistaking vigilance for love, because vigilance was the only language grief had left me fluent in. It took 11 of the worst days of my life to teach me that the reading was never actually the thing that saved anyone. It only ever bought the time. What saves people in the end is staying. Sitting on porch steps in the fading light with a mug of cold coffee, glasses too big for a small face, sliding down a small nose, no document in either of our hands, nothing left to verify. Harmony tipped the glasses up with one finger and grinned at me gap-toothed, entirely unbothered by anything the world had tried to take from her, and asked if we could go find the cat again before supper. I told her we could. I set my coffee down on the step, and I went. Renata's glasses live on Harmony's nightstand now, not in anyone's coat pocket anymore. Most nights, she sets them beside her water glass before sleep, 2 small circles of glass catching whatever light comes through the blinds from the street lamp outside. Nobody reads through them these days. They simply sit there, waiting for morning, the way some things are finally allowed to rest once they have done their work. For most of a lifetime, the man in this story believed that love meant vigilance, reading every document twice, trusting nothing he had not verified with his own hands, certain that enough diligence could hold back almost any kind of loss. It took the worst 11 days of his life to teach him something quieter and far harder to practice, that watching over the people you love and actually staying beside them are not the same act at all. The world will always hand you good reasons to retreat into your own competence when someone you love is hurting. The harder, truer work is choosing to sit with them anyway, especially on the days you have nothing useful left to offer but your presence.
I believe God gives certain people a particular kind of strength they never know they are carrying until the moment they have no choice but to use it. I believe God was in that courtroom the morning the truth finally got to speak for itself. And I believe most of all that God does not measure a father by how little he was afraid, but by how long he stayed anyway. If you were in his position, would you have trusted the system to protect your daughter? Or would you have done exactly what he did and started reading between every line yourself? Tell me in the comments which one you would have chosen and why. If this story found its way into your chest tonight, share it with someone who needs the reminder that showing up still matters more than being right. And if you have not yet subscribed, there are more stories like this one waiting for you here every week.